At dawn on July 8, 1944, a teenage Marine stood at the base of a cliff on Saipan and stared at the mouths of volcanic caves, dark openings in black rock. Quiet. No birds, no wind that mattered. Just heat, salt, and the smell of burned cordite that never fully left the island. His name was Guy Louis Gabaldon. He was 18 years old, and the war had already taught him something most grown men never learned. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield isn't a flamethrower. It's a sentence. The night before, the Japanese had thrown everything they had left into a single screaming rush. The kind American soldiers learned to fear because it didn't make sense. A mass assault, bayonets, swords, men running forward with nothing to lose and everything to prove. It lasted for hours. It ate whole companies alive. And when it ended, the ground in front of the American lines looked like it had been poured full of bodies. Somewhere around 4,000 Japanese soldiers were dead or dying. The survivors didn't retreat like a normal army. They disappeared into caves. Saipan's northern cliffs weren't just cliffs. They were a honeycomb, lava rock carved by time and expanded by shovels. Tunnels, chambers, hidden firing ports. Places you could defend with a handful of men against a battalion. And the Marines knew what caves meant in 1944. Caves meant flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades bouncing off stone, screams that didn't always stop when the flames stopped. Caves meant a slow, ugly job. The officers had a plan for that job. It involved fire. Gabaldon had a different plan. It involved words he wasn't even sure he could pronounce correctly. Because Gabaldon wasn't a typical Marine. He wasn't tall. He wasn't a clean-cut poster boy. He didn't look like the men in recruiting pamphlets. He wore a battered cap when he could get away with it, a pair of aviator sunglasses when the sun was brutal, and he carried himself like a kid who'd spent more time dodging trouble in alleys than marching on parade grounds. But he had one thing that almost nobody else in his unit had. He could speak just enough Japanese to be dangerous. Not classroom Japanese, not polished, formal speech. Street Japanese, rough, direct, imperfect, picked up in Little Tokyo, in shops and backyards, the way you learn a language when it's tied to friendship and survival instead of homework. And on Saipan, that broken Japanese was worth more than another crate of grenades. Because by early July 1944, most Marines had never seen a Japanese prisoner. They'd been told, again and again, that Japanese soldiers did not surrender. That surrender was shame. That capture was dishonor worse than death. That civilians would jump with their children instead of walking into an American camp. And on Saipan, the Marines had watched it happen. They'd found families at the bottom of cliffs. Not because an American bullet hit them, but because fear and propaganda hit them first. Japanese officers had told their people Americans would torture them, mutilate them, violate them, desecrate their dead. So when the line finally collapsed, some civilians didn't run inland. They ran upward, to cliffs with names that sounded like warnings. Suicide Cliff, Banzai Cliff. And once you've watched a mother clutch a child and step into empty air, you stop believing there's a clean way to win a war. Gabaldon understood that fear, not because he'd read about it, because he'd lived a version of it. He was born in East Los Angeles in 1926, one of 7 kids in a poor neighborhood where a boy learned fast what mattered and what didn't. At 10, he was shining shoes, running errands, watching adults make deals that weren't written down. And at 12, he did something that would decide his entire life. He moved in with a Japanese-American family, the Nakanos. They weren't just neighbors, they were his world. Meals, chores, laughter, arguments in a language he didn't fully understand at first. They taught him words, how to bow without looking weak, how to show respect without losing pride. They taught him something deeper than grammar, that people are people long before their uniforms. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and the world tore itself in half. The Nakanos were sent away, like thousands of Japanese-American families, relocated, uprooted, placed behind fences, because fear moves faster than facts in wartime. Gabaldon watched that happen. A boy in East LA watching his family, because that's what they felt like, disappear into a system that didn't care what they'd done, only what they looked like. And later, when he enlisted, he carried that memory with him. The Marine Corps didn't care why he knew Japanese. They cared that he did. Gabaldon wasn't a polished linguist, but he was confident. And confident young men can talk themselves into anything, including a war. He told recruiters he could speak Japanese. He could, sort of, enough to get noticed, enough to be useful. He received training, assignments, and eventually found himself with the 2nd Marine Division headed into the Mariana Islands. Because Saipan wasn't just another island. Saipan was a runway to Tokyo. If the Americans took Saipan, they could base B-29 bombers there, big, long-range machines that could reach Japan's home islands. That meant Saipan was going to be defended like a door to the Emperor's own house. And it was. When the Marines landed on June 15, 1944, the beaches were chaos. Artillery from hidden positions, mortars dropping like judgment, machine gun fire from angles that made no sense until you realized the island itself had been turned into a fort. Men fell before they even left the surf. The first day cost thousands of casualties across the assault. And the Japanese didn't crack. They adapted. They pulled back into caves and waited. Every cave on Saipan was its own battle. And in those first days, Gabaldon did something he technically wasn't supposed to do. He started going out at night, alone, not because he was ordered, because he believed he could do what others couldn't. He moved like someone who'd grown up avoiding trouble. Soft steps, reading shadows, listening for the small noises that tell you where a man is hiding. 2 nights after the landing, he found Japanese soldiers near a cave. He called out. In Japanese. The words weren't perfect, but the intent was clear. Drop the weapons. One of them lifted his rifle. Gabaldon shot him. The other 2 surrendered. And when Gabaldon marched them back to camp, people stared like he'd brought back a myth. A Japanese prisoner. Alive. His officer threatened him at first. Court-martial. Leaving post. Unauthorized operations. Gabaldon listened, nodded, then went out again. Because the island was teaching him something faster than regulations could. The next night, he found another cave, a small guard detail, and he did what he'd seen work in the streets. He created a story people could believe. He shot a guard, tossed a grenade to make the cave think the Americans were closer than they were, then shouted into the dark that they were surrounded, that resistance was pointless, that surrender meant water and medicine. And then men started walking out, hands up, one after another, a line of Japanese soldiers under the moon, not because a flamethrower forced them, because words did. That night changed how his officers saw him. They stopped talking court-martial. They started talking asset. And in war, being an asset sometimes means your superiors look the other way when you break rules, as long as you bring results. By July 8th, Gabaldon had already done prisoner captures that sounded impossible. But what waited at the cliffs was bigger, because after the massive Banzai charge on July 7th, the north of Saipan became a cornered room. Thousands dead, thousands trapped, and hundreds, maybe more, hiding in the caves above the cliffs. The officers wanted to end it quickly. Flamethrower tanks, artillery, collapse the caves, burn out the holdouts, reduce the problem to smoke. Gabaldon looked at the caves and saw something else, a crowd. And crowds don't all want the same thing. In every group, there are men who want to die because they're told it's honorable. And there are men who want to live, but don't know how. There are officers who fear shame more than bullets. And there are civilians who just want water. Gabaldon understood this because he understood fear. And fear can be negotiated with if you offer the right exit. So he grabbed 2 prisoners he'd taken earlier, men who had already crossed the invisible line between fight and surrender. He told them they were going back, up the cliff, into the caves, and they were going to tell everyone inside a simple truth. The war on Saipan was over. Those prisoners looked at him like he was insane, because for them, going back into the caves wasn't like walking back into a room. It was like walking back into a religion, a place where surrender was a sin. Gabaldon didn't argue. He didn't give speeches. He just looked at them, a teenager with a carbine, and said, "Broken Japanese, blunt and final, you go, or you don't live. War makes negotiators out of boys fast." At around 0730, the two prisoners started climbing the rocky path toward the cave openings. Gabaldon waited at the base of the cliff. No radio, no backup. 4 grenades on his belt, a carbine loaded with limited ammunition, and the quiet certainty that if the cave decided to pour bullets downward, his life expectancy was measured in heartbeats. He watched the cave mouths, black holes in black rock. The sun climbed. Sweat ran down his back under his gear. Minutes passed. 10, 15, 20. His plan felt thinner with each second. Maybe the prisoners were dead. Maybe the cave leadership killed them instantly. Maybe the men inside laughed at surrender offers and prepared a counterattack. Gabaldon began to consider the most likely outcome. He was about to die doing something no one asked him to do. Then, movement. A figure appeared at the mouth of one cave. A single man, hands visible, not charging, not raising a rifle, just standing there, looking down at the beach like the world had become unfamiliar. Then another, then a small group. They began to descend the path, slowly, carefully, as if expecting a trap. Gabaldon raised his carbine, because on Saipan, kindness got you killed if it came too early. He kept the weapon ready and watched their hands. No sudden moves. They reached the base. Gabaldon barked orders in Japanese. Simple, sharp phrases. "Line up. Sit down. Don't run. Anyone who runs gets shot." They obeyed. And then more people emerged. From other caves. Small clusters at first. Then larger groups. Some carried wounded men. Some helped civilians, women, older men, children, down the path. And that was when Gabaldon realized this was no longer a capture. This was crowd control. He was one Marine with a carbine standing in front of a growing mass of enemy soldiers and terrified civilians. If even 10 of them changed their minds at once, he couldn't stop it. If a Marine patrol saw this from a distance, they might open fire before asking questions. If Japanese holdouts in other caves saw a chance, they could use this crowd as cover to break out. The situation could collapse in seconds. So Gabaldon did what he'd done in the streets his whole life. He created structure. He separated soldiers from civilians. Then he separated wounded from healthy, not because it mattered immediately, but because it kept people moving, kept them busy, kept them from realizing how fragile the moment was. And while the crowd reorganized, more people kept descending. 100, 200, 300. A beach that had been empty began to fill with the living. And then a different figure appeared. An officer, not stumbling, not afraid. A man with posture, with a sword at his side. The kind of man who had survived the Banzai charge because he was either incredibly lucky or incredibly dangerous. He walked down alone and stopped a short distance from Gabaldon. And now the real negotiation began. The officer spoke first. His Japanese was clean, formal. Gabaldon's wasn't. But Gabaldon had something more important than perfect grammar. He had confidence. He spoke fast enough to sound certain. He told the officer the island was controlled, that the Imperial Navy couldn't save them, that the cliffs were surrounded, that if the Marines decided to burn the caves would become tombs. Then he offered terms: food, water, medical care, no executions. Civilians separated, wounded treated, weapons turned over, not because Gabaldon was a Geneva Convention scholar, but because he understood what the officer feared most: chaos. A surrender that turned into humiliation, a surrender that turned into slaughter. So Gabaldon promised order, and he needed the officer to believe it. The officer asked questions, testing him. How will the prisoners be treated? Will officers be humiliated? Will families be separated? Will the wounded be killed? Gabaldon answered each one, firm and direct. Yes, you will be searched. No, you will not be tortured. Yes, your weapons will be taken. No, your personal items will not be stolen. He pointed out to sea. American warships visible on the horizon. He pointed to the sky. Aircraft circling. He didn't have to name the ships. He just had to make the officer imagine what those guns could do to a cliff full of caves. Then he leaned closer and delivered the line that mattered most. If you stay inside, you die. If you come out, you live. The officer looked past him, toward the crowd already seated on the beach. He saw soldiers. He saw civilians. He saw the reality of defeat sitting in the sand. Then he bowed slightly, not surrendering his pride, but bending enough to survive. He turned and shouted commands back toward the caves, and the effect was immediate. More men emerged. More groups, in order. In waves. The officer was controlling the surrender, which meant it was real. And now the numbers accelerated. 500, 600, 700. Gabaldon's throat went dry, because the more it worked, the more impossible it became. A surrender that big created its own danger. It became a target. Gabaldon's mind raced. He had no radio, no transport, no Marines visible. If a single nervous American patrol saw a column of Japanese moving and fired, the beach would turn into a massacre. If a single Japanese fanatic decided to shout "traitor" and open fire, panic would spread like gasoline. And in panic, crowds don't obey. Crowds crush. Crowds stampede. Gabaldon needed to move them, and he needed to move them fast. But he couldn't look like he was rushing them. So he did what a good bluffer always does. He made it sound like there was more power behind him than there was. He told the officer to keep the formations tight. Soldiers front, civilians behind, wounded in the middle. No running, no shouting. Anyone breaks formation gets shot. The officer repeated it. And because the order came from an officer, it carried weight. Not American weight, Japanese weight. And that mattered. Gabaldon climbed onto a rock. He tore off a piece of cloth. An undershirt, a rag, whatever he could. He tied it to a stick, a crude surrender flag. Then he handed it to a Japanese soldier at the front rank and said something that was both threat and protection. Wave it. Never stop waving. If you stop, my Marines shoot. If you wave, they hold fire. It was half truth, half theater. But in war, theater can save lives. Then the column began to move. And suddenly, the story wasn't about caves anymore. It was about a procession. A line of surrender walking along a beach with one teenage Marine at the front, trying to keep the entire island from misreading what they were seeing. They walked north, sand under boots, heat shimmering above the ground. The ocean on one side, cliffs on the other. Gabaldon kept his carbine visible, but angled down. He wanted distant Marines to see an American silhouette leading the column, not a Japanese formation approaching. Every few seconds he glanced back. The line seemed endless. Soldiers, civilians, wounded men supported by friends, children too exhausted to cry. This wasn't the neat surrender you see in textbooks. This was the collapse of a world. And Gabaldon was the thin thread holding it together. Then he saw them. A Marine patrol ahead. 3 men. They spotted the column and immediately snapped into defensive positions behind rocks. Because from their angle, it looked like a mass of Japanese troops moving in formation. Exactly the kind of thing you don't hesitate on. Exactly the kind of thing you shoot. Gabaldon's stomach tightened. He started waving both arms above his head. He shouted in English, "American, prisoners, don't shoot." The patrol didn't lower their weapons. They couldn't trust what they were seeing. The surrender flag was small. The Japanese column was huge. One Marine running toward them could easily be bait. Gabaldon kept shouting. He pulled off his cap and waved it. He turned sideways so they could see his uniform, his posture, his gear, everything that screamed Marine if you knew what to look for. One of the patrolmen kept his rifle up, finger near the trigger, because if you're wrong in war, you die. Gabaldon got close enough that they could hear his voice clearly. He shouted his name, rank, unit, and finally, the rifle lowered, not fully, but enough. Because the patrol leader stepped forward and said the only sane question left on Earth. "What the hell is this?" Gabaldon answered fast. "Prisoners from the cliffs. Mass surrender. Need trucks, need guards, need this handled before somebody panics. The patrol leader stared at the column like it was a hallucination. Then he stared at Gabaldon, an 18-year-old private in a battered cap and sunglasses. Like he was the hallucination. How did you do this? Gabaldon didn't give a heroic speech. He didn't say courage. He didn't say destiny. He said the truth, plain and ridiculous. I talked to them. The patrol leader blinked. In Japanese, Gabaldon nodded. And the leader said something like a prayer and a curse at the same time. Run back, get the captain, now. One Marine sprinted. The other two stayed, weapons ready, watching the prisoners like they expected the whole thing to flip into violence at any second. But it didn't. The Japanese officer maintained order. The flag kept waving. Gabaldon kept walking the line like a man balancing a knife on his finger. Because even now, the most dangerous moment hadn't passed. The most dangerous moment was what came next. When American officers arrived, when they saw a private standing in front of a crowd that looked like an enemy battalion, when they had to decide whether to trust him or shut it down, and whether Gabaldon's gamble would be remembered as genius or classified as insanity. In the distance, engines, trucks, voices, a knot of Marines moving fast, and at the center, an officer, Captain John Schwab, the man who, days earlier, had threatened court-martial, now walking toward a scene that made no sense. He looked at the prisoners. He looked at Gabaldon. And for a moment, even a Marine captain didn't know what to say. Because in front of him sat one of the largest single groups of Japanese prisoners anyone on Saipan had ever seen. And somehow, the person holding the whole thing together was a teenager. Schwab stepped closer. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with calculation. He asked the question that decides whether you get punished or promoted in wartime. Did you do this alone? Gabaldon swallowed. He could tell the truth. He could tell a half-truth. He could tell a story. And whatever he said next would shape what happened to him after the prisoners were processed, and what happened to the next cave full of desperate men who still believed surrender was worse than death. Captain John Schwab stopped a few yards from the front of the column. He didn't shout. He didn't smile. He did what experienced officers do when something impossible is sitting in front of them. He tried to find the fastest way it could go wrong. 800 enemy bodies on an open beach wasn't automatically a victory. It was a bomb waiting for a spark. One panicked Marine, one Japanese holdout with a hidden pistol, one misunderstanding, one shout, one shot, and Saipan would add another massacre to its list. Schwab looked past Gabaldon to the Japanese officer keeping order. He looked at the civilians huddled behind the soldiers. He looked at the surrender flag, thin, ridiculous, and somehow holding back a war. Then he looked at Gabaldon again. Did you do this alone? Gabaldon hesitated just long enough to be honest. I talked to them, sir. Schwab's jaw tightened. That's not what I asked. Gabaldon swallowed. I had 2 prisoners carry the message up to the caves. Then I negotiated. But there's no other Marines up there. No cordon, no squads. Just me. Schwab stared for a beat. Then he did the only sane thing left. He turned and started issuing orders like a man trying to outrun the future. Set a perimeter, now. Marines fanned out along the beach, rifles ready, faces hard. Not aggressive, controlled. Because if you pointed a weapon like you hated these people, someone inside the column might decide they were being lied to. And if the column believed surrender was a lie, you didn't get a second chance. Schwab sent runners for trucks. He sent word to the prisoner processing point. He sent someone to find interpreters, MPs, anyone with experience handling mass surrender. And then, quietly, he pulled Gabaldon aside. Where's your radio? Don't have one, sir. Schwab's eyes narrowed. Authorization? You said I could operate. Lone wolf. You said, if it works, keep doing it. For a second, Schwab looked like he might explode. Then he looked back at the column again, and whatever anger he had got swallowed by logistics. Because this wasn't a courtroom, it was a battlefield. And battlefield rules are simple. If it works, you keep it. If it gets people killed, you bury it. Processing the prisoners started immediately. Search teams moved down the line, fast hands, hard eyes. Weapons first, rifles, bayonets, grenades tucked into belts, pistols hidden in cloth. Some soldiers tried to keep personal items. Letters, photos, small religious charms. Schwab allowed it. Not out of kindness, out of control. If you strip a defeated man of everything, you don't just disarm him, you humiliate him. And humiliation is fuel. So they confiscated what mattered for safety and left what mattered for dignity. It wasn't mercy. It was strategy. The beach became an assembly line. Soldiers separated from civilians. Wounded separated from healthy. Officers identified and grouped. Marines posted at intervals, faces expressionless, rifles visible. Every step was designed to send one message. You surrendered, you live, and we are still in charge. Gabaldon watched all of it with a tight throat, because this was the moment his lie could die. He'd promised water, so they brought water. He'd promised medical care, so corpsmen moved in, bandages, morphine, quick triage in the sand. He'd promised no executions, so no one got dragged behind a truck and shot. Not because the Marine Corps suddenly became gentle, but because if word spread that Gabaldon's promise was false, the next cave would fight to the last bullet. And there were still caves, lots of them. By mid-morning, the count kept climbing. A trickle became a flood. Soldiers kept emerging from the cliffs like the island itself was exhaling. Some accounts later pinned the number on that day at 807, a count that sounded like a typo until you saw the scale of the line. But the exact number mattered less than the reality. It was huge. Huge enough that Marines who hadn't seen it with their own eyes would refuse to believe it. Huge enough that officers would later argue over paperwork and credit and what capture meant. Huge enough that if even one thing went wrong, it would be remembered as the bloodiest mistake on Saipan. Schwab kept glancing at Gabaldon, like he was still trying to decide whether this kid was a genius or a magnet for disaster. Trucks arrived, then more trucks, then Marines from other units who took one look at the column and stopped in disbelief. Some muttered jokes, some made the sign of the cross, some just stared because their brains couldn't reconcile the last 3 weeks of cave fighting with this scene of mass surrender. The Japanese officer who negotiated the surrender was escorted for interrogation. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't screamed at. He was questioned carefully, because a surrendered officer could be a weapon, not for shooting. For information, how many Japanese were still alive on the island? Where were the last defensive pockets? Which caves had machine guns? Who was still commanding? And the officer, maybe out of pragmatism, maybe out of exhaustion, answered more than the Americans expected. That intelligence mattered, because Saipan's final days weren't about big battles. They were about dangerous pockets of men with nothing left but rifles and pride. Caves that could still cost dozens of Marines to clear. So if you could persuade those men to surrender, you didn't just save American lives. You saved Japanese lives. You saved civilians. You reduced the war to a quieter ending. And that was the part nobody liked to talk about because it didn't fit the heroic story of victory through fire. But it was real. Gabaldon didn't win Saipan. He changed the texture of how the last part of Saipan was fought. When the last truck rolled out and the beach finally emptied, Gabaldon didn't get a ceremony. No band, no photographer, no medal pinned on his chest while he stood rigid and blinking in the sun. He went back to his unit, cleaned his carbine, ate rations, and slept like a teenager whose body was running on borrowed adrenaline. Then the next morning, he asked to go out again. Schwab stared at him. "You're serious?" Gabaldon nodded. "There are more caves." Schwab exhaled. Then he did the thing that tells you everything about war. He approved it, because the Marine Corps could burn caves all day and still lose men. If Gabaldon could pull prisoners out with words, that was worth the risk. Even if the risk was him dying. Even if the risk was him becoming a problem later. War doesn't care about later. Over the next days, Gabaldon kept going. Night after night. Sometimes alone. sometimes with a shadowing patrol that stayed far enough back not to ruin the illusion that he was the spear tip of something bigger. He developed habits. He would stalk the mouth of a cave and listen, not for voices, for movement, for the scrape of equipment, for the subtle sounds that told you whether men inside were ready to fight or ready to flee. He would call out in Japanese, simple phrases, promises he knew he could keep, food, water, medical aid, no torture. And he'd add something else, something psychological. If you surrender to me, you live. Because it wasn't just Americans anymore. It was Gabaldon, a specific person, a face, a voice, the kind of detail fear can cling to. And word began to spread through the caves. It spread the way rumors spread in a trapped army, fast, distorted, urgent. There's a small American who speaks Japanese. He doesn't beat prisoners. He gives water. He lets civilians live. Some Japanese soldiers didn't believe it. Others desperately wanted to. And in that gap, between disbelief and hope, Gabaldon operated. He would sometimes send a surrendered soldier back into a cave to call others out. It was risky, because the messenger could be killed, or could turn, or could scream something that triggered a shootout. But Gabaldon understood people. If the messenger had already crossed the line, if he already tasted survival, he was more likely to pull others toward the same exit. And when those men came out and saw the promise was real, the next cave became easier. Not always, but often enough to matter. It created a strange phenomenon on Saipan. Some groups started sending their own messengers. A man with a cloth tied to his rifle, walking cautiously toward Marine lines. Not to attack, to ask a question. Is the one called Gabaldon here? Not is an officer here. Not is an interpreter here. Gabaldon. Because in war, trust doesn't attach to institutions. It attaches to people. And if you can become the person an enemy trusts, you can dismantle a battlefield without firing. That's what made Gabaldon dangerous. Not his carbine, his reputation. But reputation cuts both ways. Some Marines admired him. Others hated him. Because to some men, the idea of talking to the enemy felt like weakness. They'd lost friends to ambushes and snipers. They'd seen caves that had to be burned because the defenders chose death over surrender. So when Gabaldon walked back with prisoners, there were Marines who looked at him like he was cheating, like he was taking shortcuts in a war that didn't offer shortcuts. And there was another fear too. Quieter, uglier. If Gabaldon could do this, why hadn't they done it sooner? What did that say about all the men who died clearing caves the hard way? The answer is complicated, because negotiation isn't a button you press. It's a fragile thing, dependent on language, timing, culture, leadership, and sheer luck. But war doesn't like complicated answers. War likes simple ones. So Gabaldon became both a hero and an irritation, sometimes at the same time. By late July, Saipan was effectively secured. The last holdouts were hunted. Caves were cleared. The island became what the planners wanted. A platform, a place to build airfields, a place to bring in bombers, a place to move the war closer to Japan. And then the Marines looked south, to the next island, Tinian, just a few miles away, small on a map, huge in consequence, because taking Tinian meant more runways, more bombers, more pressure on Japan's home islands. So the 2nd Marine Division shifted its weight again, and Gabaldon went with it, because there were caves on Tinian too. And men inside those caves still believed surrender was a crime. If you're still with us right now, you already know this isn't just a war story. It's a story about how one teenager turned language into a weapon and risked his life without pulling a trigger. So do me a favor, hit the like button. It tells YouTube this is worth showing to more people who care about real history. And subscribe to WWII Hidden Chapters if you want more stories where the textbook version left out the human part. Now, back to Tinian, where Gabaldon's method was about to collide with the one thing you can't negotiate with, a machine gun. Tinian felt different. Same heat, same volcanic rock, same jungle that swallowed sound and distance. But the fighting was sharper, more scattered, Smaller pockets, sudden bursts, ambushes you didn't see until you were inside them. Gabaldon kept doing what he did best. He approached cave mouths, called out, offered terms. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And then, one afternoon, he approached a cave where 3 Japanese soldiers appeared at the entrance. They raised rifles. Gabaldon raised his hands, palms open, like he was trying to show them he was a human being before he was an enemy. He started speaking. Food, water, no torture, live. For a fraction of a second, it looked like the usual pattern might happen. Then Gabaldon heard a sound from his right that made the air itself feel thin. A burst, heavy, rhythmic. A machine gun, firing not in panic, but in control. The rounds tore through leaves and bark. The jungle snapped and shredded. Gabaldon dropped behind a fallen tree as bullets carved a line through the space where his head had been. The 3 soldiers at the cave scattered like sparks, 2 back inside, 1 stumbling sideways. The machine gun didn't care about negotiation. It cared about fields of fire. Gabaldon's patrol, just a handful of Marines, hit the ground behind rocks, trees, whatever cover existed. No radio, no mortars, no artillery on call. It was the kind of small unit fight that never makes headlines. Just 5 Marines and a gun that could keep them pinned until dark. The machine gun stopped. Silence. Not mercy. Patience. The gunner was waiting for someone to move. Then it opened again from a slightly different angle. Short bursts, disciplined. A veteran crew. They were walking fire across the jungle in patterns designed to trap men who thought they had a gap. 1 Marine tried to shift position. Rounds snapped into the rock near his face, showering stone chips. He froze. Everyone froze. Minutes dragged. Sweat pooled under helmets. The jungle hummed with insects that didn't care who owned the island. Gabaldon listened, and then he heard something worse than the gun. Movement behind him. Close. 3 Japanese soldiers crawling through undergrowth. Flanking. Classic. Pin with fire, then kill with grenades. Gabaldon couldn't warn the others without shouting. He couldn't shoot without lighting up the patrol's location. But if he did nothing, the grenades would land. So he did what he always did. He made a decision before fear could vote. He raised the carbine, aimed at the soldier with a grenade in his hand, and fired. 3 rounds. The soldier dropped. The grenade fell and detonated, ripping the undergrowth and throwing dirt into the air. The blast killed or crippled the other 2. And instantly, the machine gun erupted, angry now, less disciplined, pouring rounds into the smoke. Because now they knew a Marine was back there. Now they knew someone was breaking the trap. And Gabaldon, teenage negotiator, prisoner catcher, lone wolf, became just another target in a jungle full of metal. He rolled, crawled, dragged himself to new cover. The machine gun tracked. The gunner tried to stitch him into the ground. And then, impact. A hard, sick punch in his leg. A hot numbness. He looked down and saw blood spreading dark through his trousers. He'd been hit. Not a graze, a real wound. Through muscle. The kind that makes you realize you are not invincible just because you've been lucky. Gabaldon clamped down. Tourniquet, pressure, training kicking in. He tried to stay present, because the fight wasn't done. And because somewhere in that jungle, a machine gun crew still believed they could wipe out 5 Marines before anyone even knew it happened. Gabaldon told the nearest Marine through clenched teeth, "We have to stop that gun." The Marine looked at his wound and shook his head. "We have to get you out." Gabaldon's eyes snapped toward the machine gun's direction. "No, if we run, it kills us anyway." And right there, in the dirt and heat of Tinian, Gabaldon's 2 identities collided. The boy who talked men out of caves, and the Marine who still had to survive when words failed. Because some enemies don't surrender. Some enemies don't listen. And in the next minutes, Gabaldon was about to find out whether his reputation could stop bullets, or whether the only language that mattered now was fire. The machine gun was still out there. Not a cinematic rattle in the distance. A real, disciplined weapon, 7.7mm rounds cutting lanes through jungle like invisible wire. Gabaldon's leg throbbed under the tourniquet. Every heartbeat felt like someone tightening a wrench inside his thigh. The nearest Marine grabbed his web gear. "We're pulling back." Gabaldon shook his head. "Small movement, big meaning. If we move in the open, it kills us. If we stay, it kills us." So he changed the problem. He pointed with 2 fingers. Not dramatic, just precise. "That gun thinks I'm the target. Let it keep thinking that." He raised his voice, Japanese, loud enough to carry, rough enough to sound certain. "Machine gun, you're surrounded. You will die. Come out now." The answer was a burst of fire that slapped rock and bark inches above his head. No negotiation. "Fine." Gabaldon tried again, shifting to the simplest promises that had worked on Saipan. "Food, water, doctor, live." Another burst. Longer, angrier. The gunner was dumping belt. That told Gabaldon something. Not bravery. Not ideology. Something practical. They were rattled. And rattled enemies make mistakes. While the machine gun focused on Gabaldon's rock, 2 Marines crawled left through thick vegetation. Low, slow, silent. The jungle swallowed them. A 3rd Marine stayed behind, firing occasional shots. Not to hit, but to keep the gunner's attention pinned on the wrong place. Gabaldon clenched his jaw and forced himself to breathe evenly. Because if he screamed, if he panicked, if he sounded like a wounded boy, the gunner would sense it. And wounded boys don't scare anyone into surrender. So Gabaldon kept shouting, half bluff, half prayer, until the machine gun finally snapped toward him again. The gunner thought he was winning. That confidence was the opening. 2 grenades detonated on the left flank of the machine gun position. Not close, direct. The firing stopped mid-burst like someone cut the cord. Then rifle shots, sharp and fast. A scramble, a shout in Japanese, and then silence again. The Marines had hit the position. When they came back, their faces told the story before they spoke. 3 Japanese soldiers at the gun. 1 dead, 2 wounded. A Type 92 on its tripod, ammunition boxes scattered like trash from a failed future. The crew had been low on ammo. They'd been trying to hold the patrol in place long enough to bleed them out. They'd almost succeeded. Then the adrenaline drained. Gabaldon's leg went cold. The tourniquet kept him alive, but it also made time feel heavy. He didn't want to be carried. He didn't want to be the reason the patrol slowed down. But the Marines didn't debate it. They built a stretcher, rifles, ponchos, whatever held together. They moved him through the jungle in short bursts, stopping when they heard any sound that wasn't their own breathing. And somewhere in that slow retreat, Gabaldon understood a brutal truth. On Saipan, words gave him control. On Tinian, bullets reminded him control was borrowed. He made it back to friendly lines alive. A corpsman cut away fabric, cleaned the wound, worked with the calm speed of men who'd done this too many times. Morphine, bandage, a quick check for bone damage. "Through and through," the corpsman said. No shattered femur, no arterial spray. Painful, serious, but survivable. Gabaldon stared at the ceiling of a medical tent and listened to distant gunfire like it was coming from another planet. Because for him, the war was ending. Not with victory. With paperwork. Within weeks, the Marine Corps began the process that turns a living fighter into a statistic who goes home. Hospitals, forms, evaluations. Gabaldon was still a teenager, but his body was carrying a permanent reminder, a limp, a scar, and memories he didn't ask for. Back on Saipan, his officers started writing recommendations, because what happened at the cliffs couldn't be ignored forever. Capturing that many prisoners, whether you call them soldiers, civilians, or both, changed the battlefield. It saved Marine lives. It saved Japanese lives. And it embarrassed a major assumption that had dominated the Pacific War, that surrender was impossible. So the recommendation went up the chain. High, the kind of recommendation that carries a name Americans recognize instantly. Medal of Honor. And then the machine of war did what it always does. It chewed the story into smaller pieces. The recommendation was reviewed, questioned, argued over. Numbers scrutinized like accountants trying to audit chaos. Some officers believed it immediately. Some didn't. Some felt, deep down, that war should reward killing more cleanly than it rewards persuasion. And some, quietly, wondered if a Mexican-American teenager from East LA was the kind of face they wanted attached to the highest medal in the country. Nobody wrote that last part down. That's not how bias works. Bias doesn't sign its name. It just closes doors and calls it procedure. In the end, the Medal of Honor didn't happen. The award was downgraded, still a high decoration, but not the one that would have turned Gabaldon into a household name in 1944. And as the war rushed forward, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa, toward Japan itself, Gabaldon's story slipped into the background noise of victory. Gabaldon went home, back to Los Angeles, back to streets that looked the same but felt smaller. People celebrated the war ending. He didn't. Not really, because if you've watched bodies wash onto a beach, you don't come back normal. And if you've stood alone in front of hundreds of surrendered men, you don't return to ordinary life with an ordinary mind. He struggled. Jobs came and went. He carried his limp, his memories, and the strange feeling of being both proud and invisible. Then, years later, the story surfaced again, not through military channels, but through television, a show, a retelling, a public spotlight, and suddenly, people believed him because the world has a rule it rarely admits. If it isn't on camera, it isn't real. Hollywood came next, a film built around his experience, a war story packaged for an audience that wanted heroism more than complexity. And like most Hollywood war stories, it changed things, cleaned edges, softened contradictions, turned a terrifying cliff into a dramatic set. Gabaldon worked around it, trying to keep some truth in the script, trying to make the Japanese dialogue sound right, trying to protect the core of what actually mattered. That surrender is a human decision, and humans can be influenced. But the film did something else. It created pressure, because once the public knows your name, the military can't pretend it never heard of you. Not forever. So the Marine Corps revisited the record, and years after Saipan, Gabaldon's decoration was upgraded again to the Navy Cross, one of the highest awards for valor. It was recognition. It was late. And for Gabaldon, it still left a question hanging in the air like heat over volcanic rock. Why not the Medal of Honor in the first place? That question became part of his life. Supporters pushed. Veterans spoke up. Politicians listened, sometimes sincerely, sometimes for optics. Historians argued. Some skeptics said the numbers were exaggerated, that many prisoners were civilians, that others must have helped. Others pointed out something very simple. Even if you cut the numbers in half, even if you strip away every exaggeration, the Corps Act remains insane. A teenager walking toward caves after the bloodiest Banzai charge of the campaign and pulling human beings out with language. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because the enemy was weak. That happens because one person understood a thing war tries to erase. The enemy is still made of people, and people can be reached. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes is enough to change history. Gabaldon's story also sits in an uncomfortable place in military culture, because armies are built to solve problems with force. That's their job. But modern war learned, slowly, painfully, that force isn't the only lever. Language matters. Culture matters. Fear matters. Promises matter, especially if you keep them. Gabaldon didn't just talk people out. He created a bridge in a war designed to burn bridges. He used identity, trust, and credibility as tactical tools. He proved that psychological pressure can be cleaner than fire, and sometimes more effective. And that lesson didn't die in 1944. It echoed forward, into training, into doctrine, into the way modern militaries talk about cultural awareness and psychological operations. Not because Gabaldon wrote a manual, but because his existence ruined a dangerous myth that negotiation is weakness. On Saipan, negotiation was courage under a different name. In his later years, Gabaldon kept returning to the same idea, that he saved lives, that he did it in a way the war didn't know how to reward, that his biggest weapon wasn't his carbine, It was his ability to make an enemy imagine a future beyond death. He eventually died as an old man, buried with honors. But the argument never fully died with him. Was he denied the highest recognition because of bureaucracy? Because of disbelief? Because of prejudice? Because war doesn't like heroes who win without killing? That debate is part of why his story still matters. Because it forces us to ask what we value in war and what we choose to remember. If you made it this far, drop a comment and tell me what you think. Was Gabaldon's story proof that cultural understanding can outperform firepower? Or was it a one-in-a-million moment that the military didn't know how to process? Hit like if you want more chapters like this pulled out of the shadows. Subscribe to WWII Hidden Chapters, because these stories don't survive unless we keep telling them. And if someone in your family served, any theater, any country, tell us below. Let's keep the memory alive together. Because Saipan wasn't just an island. It was a test of doctrine, of fear, of what happens when an army believes an enemy will never surrender. And then a teenager proves them wrong. The caves at the cliffs are still there. The rock hasn't changed. The ocean still hits the shore with the same indifferent rhythm. But the story hanging over those caves is different now. Not a story of flames and bodies. A story of a small Marine who walked forward with broken Japanese and found a way to end part of a war without adding more dead to the sand. And that is a kind of bravery most people never learn to recognize until it's gone.